I've been hitchhiking for years. Sometimes it was to save a little cash, sometimes to meet people on the road, but mostly it was because I liked the feeling of being untethered, no commitments, no set schedule. I was on my way from Denver to a small town in Nevada, standing on the edge of a lonely highway with miles of desert stretching in every direction. The first few rides went well. People were generally polite, or at least indifferent, and I got used to the rhythm of being dropped off at random stops, waiting for the next stranger to pick me up. I was tired, but it was still early evening, and I figured I had at least a couple more rides ahead before I'd need to crash somewhere. I stood by the roadside, the sun dipping below the horizon, when a pickup truck pulled up. The truck was older, a bit beat up, but not out of place for the area. The driver rolled down his window. A man in his 50s, maybe, with weathered skin and a baseball cap pulled low over his face. He gave me a once-over, his expression unreadable. "Where are you headed?" he asked, his voice gravelly but calm. I told him I was on my way west, hoping he'd be going in the same direction. He nodded once, motioning to the passenger seat. "Hop in. I can take you part of the way." I hesitated for a second. Something about the way he spoke, or maybe it was his overall demeanor, gave me a flicker of doubt. But that's part of the deal with hitchhiking. You never know who's going to pick you up. I threw my bag in the back of the truck and climbed into the passenger seat. The truck smelled faintly of cigarettes and old leather. The upholstery was worn, the dashboard covered in dust. As we pulled back onto the road, the hum of the engine was the only sound. The man didn't speak much, which was fine by me. I wasn't in the mood for small talk. The sky grew darker as we drove, the desert fading into a shadowy blur outside the window. I tried to relax, but something kept me on edge. Maybe it was the way the driver kept glancing at me out of the corner of his eye, or maybe it was just the isolation of the road. There was nothing around us for miles, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was out here with no backup. If anything went wrong, there wouldn't be anyone to help. After a while, I tried to make conversation, asked him where he was headed, how long he'd been on the road. He gave short answers, not offering much, and I got the sense he wasn't the type who liked talking about himself. Eventually, I gave up and stared out the window, watching the darkness swallow up the landscape. Then he started humming under his breath. It was a low, tuneless sound, more like someone trying to fill the silence than an actual song. I glanced over at him. His eyes were still fixed on the road, but his hands had tightened on the steering wheel, his knuckles white. "You all right?" I asked, trying to keep my voice casual. He didn't answer at first, just kept humming. The sound made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. My pulse quickened, and I couldn't tell why. Maybe it was the tension in the air, the way the truck seemed to press in around me. I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. Finally, he spoke. "Been driving this road for a long time," he muttered, almost like he was talking to himself. "Too long." I didn't know how to respond, so I just nodded, hoping he wouldn't elaborate. But he did. "They say you see things after a while," he continued, his voice low. "Spend too long out here alone, and the desert plays tricks on your mind." I glanced out the window, my chest tightening. The endless stretch of road, the dark outline of the horizon, the quiet, it all felt oppressive. "What kind of things?" I asked, not really wanting to know the answer. He didn't respond right away. His fingers tapped rhythmically on the steering wheel, as if he was thinking. Things that aren't really there. You start to wonder if what you're seeing is real, or if you're just imagining it. I shifted uncomfortably in my seat. The way he spoke, slow, deliberate, made me uneasy. But I reminded myself that people on the road had their quirks. Maybe he was just tired. I tried to brush off the growing unease, but it clung to me, like something heavy settling on my shoulders. We drove on in silence for another mile or so before he spoke again. This time his voice was barely a whisper. "They follow you, you know." I felt my pulse quicken. "Who follows you?" He didn't answer, just kept driving, his hands gripping the wheel so tightly now that I thought he might pull it off. His eyes were locked on the road ahead, unblinking. I stared at him, my heart racing. Was he messing with me? Was this some kind of weird game? But his expression was blank, almost mechanical, as if he was lost in thought, or something worse. "I think I'll get out at the next stop," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "It's probably not too far now." He didn't respond. The truck just kept moving forward, the road stretching endlessly in front of us. I swallowed hard, my throat tight with anxiety. Something was wrong. I couldn't put my finger on it, but I could feel it in the pit of my stomach, that sinking feeling you get when you know something's about to go bad. The truck rumbled on, the hum of the engine growing louder in the otherwise still night. I glanced out the window, hoping to see a sign, a gas station, anything that would give me a reason to get out. But the desert stretched on, uninterrupted, just an endless expanse of darkness with no landmarks in sight. My palms were sweating, and I wiped them on my jeans, trying to stay calm. It was probably nothing. The driver was just weird, right? Plenty of people out on these roads spent too much time alone, their minds playing tricks on them. That had to be it. But the more I thought about it, the more the uneasy feeling gnawed at me. Something wasn't adding up. I stole another glance at the driver. His face was set in stone, his eyes never leaving the road, his hands gripping the steering wheel tighter with every passing minute. He hadn't spoken again since his strange comment about being followed, and the silence in the truck was suffocating. "Hey," I said, my voice shaky, trying to break the tension. "You can just drop me off at the next turn, okay? I'll be fine from there." Still, no response. I swallowed hard, my heart pounding in my chest. "Seriously, man, I don't mind walking a bit. It's no big deal." The driver's eyes flickered toward me, just for a second, before snapping back to the road. His knuckles were white against the steering wheel. My chest tightened with a growing sense of dread. He wasn't going to stop. I shifted in my seat, running through my options. I could try forcing him to pull over, but the idea of making him mad didn't sit well with me. If he snapped, I had no idea what he was capable of. I was stuck, and that realization made my pulse race even faster. The road was empty, the desert silent except for the occasional whistle of wind. The only sound inside the truck was the low hum of the engine and the rhythmic tapping of the driver's fingers on the wheel. I needed to think of something fast. "Look, man, I'm not feeling too well," I said, trying a different tactic. "Could you just pull over for a second? I think I might be sick." The driver didn't say a word. He didn't even blink. His face was still locked in that same expression, like he wasn't even hearing me. My stomach turned, panic clawing at the edges of my mind. This wasn't right. He had to know I wanted out, but he wasn't stopping. I turned and reached for the door handle, my hands trembling. I didn't know what I'd do, maybe jump out if I had to, but the moment I touched the handle, the driver's hand shot out and grabbed my wrist. His grip was strong, almost painfully so. "Don't," he said, his voice low and cold, his eyes fixed straight ahead. "It's not safe out there." My heart thudded painfully in my chest, and I yanked my hand back, my throat tightening with fear. "What do you mean?" I asked, trying to keep my voice calm, but there was no hiding the tremor in my words. He didn't answer, just kept driving. I sat back, trying to put as much distance between us as the small cab would allow. The air felt heavy, thick with the tension building between us. I didn't know what his deal was. Maybe he was paranoid, maybe something had happened to him on these roads before, but it didn't matter. I needed to get out of that truck. We drove in silence for what felt like an eternity. The darkness outside pressed in on us, making the narrow beam of the headlights feel even more claustrophobic. Every few minutes, I glanced over at him, hoping he would snap out of whatever trance he was in and let me go. But his eyes never left the road, his expression as cold and distant as before. My mind raced, trying to come up with a plan. I could jump out of the truck, but at the speed we were going, I wasn't sure I'd make it without getting hurt. I could grab the steering wheel and force him to stop, but the risk of causing an accident wasn't something I wanted to gamble with. Suddenly, the truck began to slow down. I glanced out the window, expecting to see a rest stop or a town, but there was nothing, just more desert. I looked over at the driver, confusion and fear knotting in my stomach. "What are you doing?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. He didn't answer. The truck crawled to a stop in the middle of the empty road. There were no lights, no signs, no reason to stop. My pulse quickened, my breath catching in my throat. "This is where you get out," he said, his voice flat, emotionless. I stared at him, my heart hammering in my chest. "What? Here? There's nothing out here." He turned to me, his eyes dark and unreadable. "You don't want to keep going." The way he said it sent a chill down my spine. There was something final about it, something that told me I didn't have a choice. I glanced out the window again, my stomach twisting. The desert was vast and empty, the moon barely visible behind a blanket of clouds. "Look," I said, my voice shaking. "I don't know what's going on, but I'm not getting out in the middle of nowhere. Just take me to the next town, and I'll be on my way." His grip on the steering wheel tightened, his knuckles turning white. "Get out," he repeated, his voice low and dangerous. My breath caught in my throat. I knew I had to make a decision, and fast. I could stay in the truck and risk whatever he had planned, or I could get out and take my chances in the desert. Neither option felt good, but the look in his eyes told me that staying in the truck was the worst of the two. I opened the door, my hands trembling as I climbed out. The cold desert air hit me like a slap in the face, and I stepped onto the road, my legs unsteady beneath me. The truck's headlights cast long, eerie shadows across the cracked asphalt, and for a moment, I thought I saw something move in the darkness. But when I looked again, it was gone. The driver watched me for a moment, his face expressionless, before slamming the truck into gear. The engine roared, and without another word, he sped off, leaving me standing there alone on the side of the road. My pulse pounded in my ears, and I watched as the taillights of the truck disappeared into the distance. The silence of the desert was overwhelming, the cold wind biting at my skin. I stood there, stunned, trying to make sense of what had just happened. I was alone, in the middle of nowhere, and for the first time, I realized how vulnerable I really was. The truck's taillights vanished into the darkness, leaving me standing alone on the deserted road. The vast expanse of the desert stretched out on either side, silent and empty. The wind cut through my jacket, cold and sharp, and I wrapped my arms around myself, trying to shake the sense of dread crawling up my spine. I looked both ways down the road, hoping to spot another vehicle, some sign of life, but there was nothing. The only sound was the faint rustle of the wind and the crunch of gravel under my boots as I took a few tentative steps forward. The reality of my situation started to sink in. I was alone miles from anywhere, with no idea how long I'd be stuck out here. I kicked at the ground, cursing under my breath. The guy in the truck had been acting weird, sure, but dumping me in the middle of the desert? That was beyond strange. It was dangerous. I scanned the horizon, squinting against the faint light of the moon. Maybe I could walk. There had to be a gas station or a town somewhere along this road, right? The thought of spending the night out here, with nothing but the cold wind and the empty desert for company, wasn't exactly appealing. As I began walking, I noticed something odd. About a quarter of a mile down the road, there was a faint flicker of light, barely visible against the darkness. It hadn't been there a moment ago. I stopped, staring at it, trying to figure out if it was real or just my eyes playing tricks on me. But no, it was definitely there, a soft glow, like a distant street light or a porch light. I felt a flicker of hope. Maybe there was a house or a small building nearby. If I could just reach it, I'd have shelter for the night. I picked up the pace, my footsteps quickening as I headed toward the light. The closer I got, the brighter it became, though the road remained silent, still devoid of any cars or movement. After a few minutes, I realized the light wasn't coming from a building. It was coming from a car parked just off the road, partially hidden by a dip in the landscape. The headlights were on, illuminating the ground in front of it, but the vehicle itself was eerily still, as if whoever was inside hadn't moved in a long time. My heart skipped a beat. The situation was strange. Too strange. Why would a car be parked out here, in the middle of nowhere, with the lights on but no one around? I slowed my pace, my instincts telling me to be cautious. I approached the car slowly, my eyes scanning the area for any sign of movement. The headlights cast long shadows, making the scene feel even more surreal. As I got closer, I could make out the shape of a figure slumped over the steering wheel, their face hidden by the angle and the darkness inside the car. A cold wave of unease washed over me. Something wasn't right. "Hey," I called out, keeping my distance from the car. "You all right?" No response. My pulse quickened, and I hesitated, unsure of what to do. Every rational part of my mind was telling me to walk away, to keep moving and find another way out of this mess. But the figure in the car didn't move, didn't respond, and the silence felt heavy, oppressive. I took a step closer, my eyes fixed on the figure inside. They were completely still. Too still. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. Whoever was in that car wasn't alive. I froze, my breath catching in my throat, and my mind raced with 1,000 questions. How long had the car been sitting here? Who was inside? And why hadn't anyone found them? Just as I was about to back away, my foot hit something on the ground. I glanced down and saw a small, folded piece of paper lying near the front tire. It looked out of place, as if it had been deliberately left there. Against my better judgment, I bent down and picked it up. The paper was worn and creased, but I could still make out the writing on it. Neat, deliberate handwriting in dark ink. My heart pounded in my chest as I unfolded the paper and read the single sentence written on it. They told me to wait for you. The words hit me like a bucket of cold water. I stared at the note, my hands trembling, trying to make sense of what I was reading. It didn't make any sense. Who had written this? And how could they have known I would be here? I took a step back, my mind racing. I needed to get out of here. Now. But before I could move, I heard the sound of an engine revving behind me. I spun around, and to my horror, I saw the truck, the same beat-up pickup that had dropped me off just minutes ago, heading back down the road, its headlights cutting through the darkness. The driver hadn't left after all. He'd been watching me. My pulse spiked, and I backed away from the car, panic rising in my chest. I didn't know what was going on, but I wasn't about to stick around and find out. I turned and bolted, running as fast as I could down the road, my feet pounding against the pavement, my breath coming in short, ragged gasps. The truck's engine roared louder as it sped up, closing the distance between us. My heart raced, and I could hear the blood pounding in my ears as I ran. I didn't dare look back, but I knew the driver was getting closer. I veered off the road, my legs burning as I sprinted into the open desert, my boots kicking up dirt and sand with every step. The truck screeched to a halt behind me, and I heard the door slam open. I didn't stop. I kept running, the fear driving me forward. And then I heard it, his voice, calm and deliberate, calling out to me from somewhere behind. I told you, they're always waiting. His words echoed through the desert air, chilling me to my core. They're always waiting. My breath came in short, ragged gasps as I ran through the open desert, the terrain uneven beneath my feet. I didn't dare look back, but I could hear his footsteps now, the crunch of gravel and dirt getting louder, closer. The truck's headlights illuminated the ground in front of me, casting long, eerie shadows that seemed to stretch out and grab at me as I stumbled forward. I didn't know how long I could keep running. My legs were burning and every muscle in my body screamed for me to stop, but I pushed through the pain. I couldn't let him catch me. I didn't know what he wanted or why he had brought me here, but one thing was clear. I wasn't supposed to make it out of this. I tripped over something, a rock, or maybe just the uneven ground, and went down hard, my palms scraping against the dirt. My heart pounded in my chest, and for a second, I was sure it was over. He was going to catch up, drag me back to that truck, and whatever sick game he was playing would end with me disappearing into the desert, never to be seen again. But then, in the distance, I saw something, a faint glow on the horizon. I squinted through the darkness, trying to make sense of it. It wasn't the headlights from the truck. This light was different, softer, like the glow from a town or a gas station. Hope surged through me, pushing me back to my feet. I ran toward the light, my legs trembling beneath me. The ground was uneven, my body exhausted, but the thought of reaching safety kept me going. My breath was shallow, my chest tight, but I focused on the glow ahead, praying it wasn't some mirage conjured by my desperation. The footsteps behind me slowed. I risked a glance over my shoulder and saw the driver standing still, watching me from a distance. His silhouette was barely visible in the dim light from the truck, but I could see him clearly enough to know he wasn't chasing me anymore. He was letting me go. But why? I didn't care. I kept running, stumbling through the desert until the ground beneath me flattened out and the glow became brighter, more distinct. Finally, after what felt like hours, I reached a small, rundown gas station sitting at the edge of the road. The neon sign buzzed faintly overhead, casting a sickly green glow over the cracked asphalt. The station looked abandoned. No cars, no sign of movement. But the lights were on, and that was all I needed. I rushed toward the door, my hands shaking as I reached for the handle. My pulse raced as I yanked it open, half expecting it to be locked, but it wasn't. I stumbled inside, my body collapsing against the cool metal frame. The gas station was as empty as I'd feared, but the lights were on, and that was enough to make me feel safer. I could hear the faint hum of the refrigerators, the soft buzz of the fluorescent lights, but otherwise, it was silent. No clerk, no customers, just me and the sound of my own heavy breathing. I staggered to the counter, scanning the place for a phone. There wasn't one. My chest tightened with fear, and I cursed under my breath. Of course, there wouldn't be a phone in a place like this. I'd have to wait until someone else came along. But what if the driver showed up first? I turned toward the door, my body trembling, and peered out the dirty glass. The headlights from the truck were still on, but the driver hadn't moved. He was standing beside the truck, just watching the gas station, his figure barely visible in the dim light. He wasn't coming any closer, but he wasn't leaving either. He was waiting. My breath quickened, panic rising in my chest again. I didn't know what to do. My options were limited and none of them felt good. I could stay here and hope someone else came by, or I could try to slip out the back and disappear into the desert. But where would I go? The nearest town had to be miles away, and I wasn't sure I had the strength to make it. I paced back and forth, my mind racing, trying to come up with a plan. And then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw something, a small piece of paper taped to the side of the counter. I frowned and walked over to it, my hands still shaking as I peeled it off the edge of the counter. The handwriting was neat and deliberate, just like the note I'd found near the car earlier. My pulse spiked as I read the words. He's not the only one waiting. I felt a wave of nausea wash over me. My hands trembled, and I dropped the note as though it had burned me. What the hell is going on? How could anyone have known I'd end up here? The timing, the place, it was too much to be a coincidence. I backed away from the counter, my chest tightening with fear. Something about this whole situation was wrong. Very wrong. But before I could process it any further, the sound of the gas station door creaking open cut through the silence. I spun around, my heart leaping into my throat. The door was slowly swinging inward, the faint light from outside casting a long shadow across the floor. But no one was there. The wind, I told myself. It's just the wind. But I didn't believe it. I took a step back, my body trembling, and glanced toward the back of the store. There was an emergency exit, a narrow door that led out into the desert behind the station. My only other way out. But could I risk it? Then I heard it. Footsteps. Not the driver's. Someone else. My pulse thundered in my ears, and I turned toward the door, straining to see who, or what, was outside. The footsteps grew louder, closer, but still, no one appeared. I could feel my breath catching in my throat, my legs trembling as I backed toward the emergency exit. And then, out of the shadows, someone stepped into the gas station. It wasn't the driver. It was the figure from the car. The person slumped over the steering wheel, the one I'd thought was dead. But they weren't dead. They were walking. The figure stepped into the gas station, moving with slow, deliberate steps, their face still partially hidden by the shadows. My stomach twisted with fear as I realized that the person I had assumed was dead was now walking toward me. I froze, my back pressed against the counter, unable to process what I was seeing. They had been slumped over the steering wheel, lifeless, or at least that's what I thought. But now, here they were moving, their head tilted slightly to the side as though they were trying to focus on me. The dim light from the flickering neon sign outside illuminated their face, just enough for me to see that their skin was pale, almost sickly. Their clothes were dirty, stained with something dark that looked too much like blood for my comfort. And their eyes were hollow, empty in a way that sent chills down my spine. I swallowed hard, my breath catching in my throat. I wanted to say something, to ask if they needed help, but the words wouldn't come. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what was happening. Maybe they had passed out in the car, and now they were just disoriented. Maybe this was just some bizarre accident. But deep down, I knew better. There was something wrong with this person. They kept walking toward me, their movements slow and unnatural, almost like they were being pulled along by an invisible force. My pulse quickened, and I took a step back, my eyes darting toward the emergency exit at the back of the store. I needed to get out. Now. Hey, I called out, my voice shaky, trying to keep the distance between us. Are you okay? No response. The figure kept moving forward, their eyes locked on me in a way that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. My chest tightened with fear, and I felt a bead of sweat roll down the side of my face. The driver's words echoed in my mind. They're always waiting. Who was this person? What were they doing here? And why did it feel like they'd been waiting for me all along? I took another step back, my foot catching on the edge of the counter. Stay back, I said louder this time, though my voice wavered. The figure didn't stop. They were only a few feet away now, their gaze still fixed on me. My body tensed, ready to bolt, but before I could make a move, the figure spoke. You shouldn't have come here. My blood ran cold. The voice was low, almost mechanical, as though the words were being forced out of them. Their lips barely moved, and the sound didn't match the expression on their face. An expression that was eerily blank, emotionless. I didn't know what to say. My mind was screaming at me to get out, to run, but my legs felt like they were made of lead. All I could do was stand there, staring at the figure as they took another step forward. You shouldn't have come here, they repeated, the same flat, lifeless tone. My chest tightened as I backed away, inching closer to the emergency exit. I wasn't going to wait around to find out what they wanted. I needed to get out of this gas station. Now! I spun around and ran for the back door, my breath coming in ragged gasps as I fumbled with the handle. My hands were shaking so badly that I struggled to get the door open. But finally, with a loud creak, it swung outward, and I burst into the cold desert night. The wind hit me hard, and for a moment I stood there, gasping for air, trying to calm my racing heart. I glanced over my shoulder, half expecting the figure to be right behind me. But they weren't. The gas station door was still open, the soft glow of the neon sign casting eerie shadows across the cracked pavement. But the figure hadn't followed me. I took a step back, my mind spinning. I needed to keep moving to get as far away from this place as possible. But just as I turned to run, I saw something that made my stomach drop. There, in the distance, illuminated by the dim light of the gas station, was the truck. The driver was standing beside it, just as he had been before, watching, waiting. My pulse spiked, and I backed away, my eyes darting between the gas station and the truck. The figure inside the station wasn't coming after me, but the driver was still there. He hadn't moved, hadn't said a word, but his presence was enough to keep me paralyzed with fear. What was he waiting for? My thoughts were interrupted by a noise behind me, the sound of footsteps. I turned sharply, expecting the worst, but what I saw made my blood run cold. There was another figure. This one was standing near the back of the gas station, hidden in the shadows. They hadn't been there before. At least I hadn't noticed them. But now, they were there, watching me just like the driver had been. They were too far away for me to make out any details, but I could see the faint outline of their body, their posture unnervingly similar to the person I had seen inside the gas station. I wasn't alone out here. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. Whoever or whatever these people were, they were surrounding me. I was trapped. My breath quickened, panic clawing at the edges of my mind. I couldn't go back inside the gas station, and I couldn't run toward the truck. The desert stretched out behind me, vast and empty, but I knew that running into the open wilderness was a gamble I might not survive. I was stuck, and the walls were closing in. I looked back toward the gas station one more time, hoping for some kind of escape, but that's when I saw it, something that made my heart stop cold. The figure inside the gas station was no longer slumped over or walking toward me. They were standing perfectly still, just inside the door, their face now illuminated by the dim light. And in their hand, they were holding something, a small, folded piece of paper, just like the one I had found earlier. My pulse thundered in my ears as I stared at the paper, dread building in my chest. I didn't need to read it to know what it said. They're waiting for you. The figure inside the gas station stood motionless, the folded piece of paper hanging loosely in their hand. My heart pounded in my chest, and I felt frozen in place. I didn't need to read the note. I knew what it said. The same message. The same warning. They're waiting for you. I backed away slowly, my legs trembling, my eyes darting between the figure in the gas station and the truck parked just beyond the glow of the neon sign. The driver hadn't moved, his silhouette still standing beside the truck, watching. Always watching. And then there was the other figure, another stranger lurking in the shadows at the back of the station. They hadn't moved either, but their presence was unmistakable. I was being surrounded. My breath came in quick, shallow bursts, and I could feel the cold sweat trickling down my back. I had no idea what these people wanted or how they had set this up. None of it made any sense, but what I did know was that I couldn't stay here. I had to make a decision. Run into the open desert and risk getting lost, or face whatever was waiting for me if I stayed. Before I could even think about making my move, the figure inside the gas station finally shifted. They didn't walk or speak. Instead, they simply raised the note, holding it up for me to see, as if offering it to me like some kind of sick invitation. My pulse raced as I stared at the note, feeling the weight of the message pressing down on me. They were waiting. But for what? Enough of this, I whispered to myself, my voice barely audible above the sound of the wind whipping around me. I needed to stop playing into their hands. I needed to get out of here fast. I took a deep breath and made my decision. I was going to head into the desert. It wasn't safe, but it was better than being cornered by these people, or whatever they were. With one last glance toward the gas station, I turned and sprinted toward the open stretch of desert behind the building. My legs burned with the effort, and the uneven ground made every step a challenge. But I pushed through, my eyes fixed on the horizon. There was no clear path, no lights, no markers to guide me. Just the emptiness of the desert stretching out before me, an endless expanse of black. I ran until my lungs screamed for air, until my heart felt like it would burst. But I didn't stop. I couldn't stop. Every instinct I had was telling me to keep going, to put as much distance between myself and those figures as possible. I had no idea where I was going, but that didn't matter. I just needed to get away. But then, as I looked over my shoulder to check if they were following me, I saw something that made me stumble to a halt. The truck's headlights were off. At first, I thought the driver had finally left, but then I saw the faint outline of the truck in the distance, barely visible in the moonlight. It hadn't moved. It was still parked in the same spot, but the lights were off, and the driver was no longer standing beside it. My heart skipped a beat. I spun around, searching the dark landscape for any sign of movement, any clue as to where the driver might be. But the desert was silent, empty. I couldn't see anything. A knot of fear tightened in my stomach. Where had he gone? Before I could process what was happening, I heard a sound behind me, a soft crunch of footsteps on gravel. My blood ran cold, and I whipped around, my eyes scanning the darkness. At first, I didn't see anything, just a faint outline of the gas station in the distance. But then, slowly, a figure emerged from the shadows. It was the driver. He was walking toward me, his pace slow and deliberate, like he had all the time in the world. My breath caught in my throat as I watched him approach, his expression as calm and detached as ever. He didn't seem to be in any hurry, but the look in his eyes told me everything I needed to know. He wasn't going to stop until he had me. Panic surged through me, and I turned to run, but my legs felt heavy, weighed down by exhaustion and fear. My lungs burned, and every step was harder than the last, but I forced myself to keep going, my mind racing with the terrifying realization that I might not be able to outrun him. I glanced over my shoulder, expecting to see the driver right behind me, but to my surprise, he had stopped. He wasn't running after me. He wasn't even moving. He just stood there, watching, the same eerie calmness in his eyes. And that's when I saw them. More figures. They were emerging from the darkness, slowly spreading out across the desert like shadows. There had to be at least 5 or 6 of them, all walking in the same slow, deliberate manner as the driver. Their faces were barely visible in the moonlight, but I could see enough to know that they weren't here to help. They were all waiting. My pulse pounded in my ears, and I felt the ground shift beneath my feet as I realized the truth. This wasn't just about the driver or the gas station. It wasn't just about a strange hitchhiking ride gone wrong. There were more of them. More people, more strangers, all waiting for something I couldn't understand. And they were closing in on me. I turned and ran again, my legs trembling with fear and exhaustion. But no matter how fast I moved, it didn't seem to matter. The figures kept coming, their slow, methodical pace never changing. It was as though they knew I couldn't escape, as though they had all the time in the world to catch me. My breath came in ragged gasps, and I stumbled forward, my mind racing with 100 different thoughts, none of them making sense. Why were they after me? What did they want? And then, out of nowhere, it hit me. The notes. They'd been waiting for me all along. The note on the ground by the car, the one inside the gas station, they weren't warnings. They were instructions. They had known I would come this way. They had been preparing for me. I wasn't a victim of some random coincidence. I was part of something much bigger, something I didn't understand. My chest tightened with dread, and I pushed myself harder, trying to outrun the inevitable, but I knew it was too late. The figures were closing in, and there was nowhere left to go. I stumbled again, my body collapsing against the cold, hard ground, and for a moment I thought about giving up. Maybe if I stopped running, if I let them catch me, it would be over. Maybe whatever they wanted from me would be quick, painless. But then I heard it, the sound of an engine revving in the distance. I looked up, squinting through the darkness, and saw a pair of headlights cutting through the night, heading straight toward me. A car. Someone else was coming. My heart leapt in my chest, and I scrambled to my feet, waving my arms wildly, hoping, praying that whoever was driving would stop and help me. The figures were still coming, but I had a chance. I wasn't going to let them catch me. The car sped closer, the engine roaring as it approached. I waved again, my legs trembling beneath me, but just as the car was about to reach me, it veered off the road and came to a screeching halt a few feet away. The driver's door swung open, and someone stepped out. It wasn't a stranger. It was the driver from the truck. My blood turned to ice as I realized the horrifying truth. I hadn't escaped at all. The sight of the driver stepping out of the car sent a jolt of terror through me. My legs nearly gave out beneath me as I watched him approach, his figure outlined by the car's headlights. It was the same man, the same calm, detached look on his face. The same driver who had left me stranded on the road just minutes ago. But now, there was something even more unsettling in the way he moved, like he wasn't just playing a game anymore. He was closing in, and he had no intention of letting me go. My breath came in shallow gasps, my mind racing with fear. How had he gotten ahead of me? How had he known exactly where I'd be? My thoughts felt like a tangled mess of confusion and dread. None of this made sense, but I didn't have time to make sense of it. Behind me, the other figures continued to move through the darkness, their slow, steady steps almost mechanical. There were more of them now, too many to count, all heading toward me from different directions. They moved like a swarm, closing the gap between us with unnerving patience. The driver stood in front of me, his eyes locked on mine, that same cold expression fixed on his face. My heart thundered in my chest, and I backed away, desperate to find a way out, but the desert stretched endlessly behind me. There was nowhere to run. "What do you want?" I demanded, my voice trembling barely more than a whisper. It felt useless to ask, but I needed answers. I needed something to make sense of the nightmare unfolding around me. He didn't answer right away. He simply stared at me, his head tilting slightly to the side, as if studying me. Then, in that same low, detached voice, he finally spoke. "You were never meant to leave." A chill ran down my spine, and I took another step back, my legs shaking. "What do you mean?" The driver's expression didn't change. "You came this way for a reason. We've been waiting for you." The words hit me like a slap in the face, and my stomach twisted with dread. The notes, the strange, deliberate warnings, they hadn't been random. They'd been planned. Everything, the strange encounters, the truck breaking down, the figures in the desert. It was all part of something I hadn't understood. Until now. My mind raced, struggling to comprehend what he was saying. "What do you want with me? Why are you doing this?" The driver's eyes darkened, and he took a slow, deliberate step forward. "It's not just me," he said quietly. "We all want something. Wait. My throat tightened as I realized what he meant. The figures in the desert, the people who had been watching me, closing in, they weren't just bystanders. They were part of this. They had been waiting for me, too. My pulse pounded in my ears, and I glanced over my shoulder. The other figures were almost upon me now, their faces still obscured by the shadows, but I could feel their presence, silent, patient waiting. I had no idea who they were or why they wanted me, but the fear gnawing at the edges of my mind told me that whatever they wanted, it wasn't good. I turned back to the driver, my voice trembling. Please, just let me go. I don't know what this is, but I don't belong here. The driver's gaze didn't waver. That's where you're wrong, he said softly. You've always belonged here. My breath caught in my throat. I didn't understand. I didn't belong anywhere near this desert, near these people. Yet somehow, his words carried a strange sense of finality, as if this had all been decided long before I had even stepped onto the road. The driver took another step forward, and I could see the faintest hint of a smile tugging at the corners of his lips. Something dark, something unsettling. I backed away, my hands trembling, but I knew it was pointless. There was nowhere to go. The figures were closing in, their slow march closing off any escape. I was trapped between the driver and the growing crowd of silent strangers. And then, just when I thought it was over, something unexpected happened. The driver turned toward the approaching figures, his expression suddenly tense. He glanced back at me, something flickering behind his eyes, something like fear. For the first time since this nightmare began, he didn't look like he was in control. Without warning, he stepped toward me, his movements hurried, his voice low and urgent. Run, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. My heart skipped a beat, and I stared at him in shock. What? Run, he repeated, more forceful this time. You don't have much time. They're not going to stop. Not until they have what they want. I didn't know what to think. This was the same man who had lured me into the middle of nowhere, who had trapped me with these people. Yet now, he was telling me to run. Was it a trick? Another part of the game? Or was he really trying to help me? But there was no time to question it. The figures were too close now, their shapes shifting in the darkness. And whatever had caused the driver to panic was enough to push me into action. I turned and bolted, my legs barely able to carry me as I sprinted away from the crowd. My lungs burned with each breath, and the fear pulsing through my veins pushed me faster, harder. I didn't know where I was going. There was nothing out here but miles of desert, but anywhere was better than here. Behind me, I could hear the shuffle of footsteps, the low murmur of voices carried by the wind. I didn't dare look back. I couldn't. I just had to keep moving, keep running until I found a way out, no matter how hopeless it seemed. The landscape blurred around me, the cold desert air biting at my skin as I ran blindly into the night. My body screamed in protest, every muscle aching, but I couldn't stop. I wouldn't stop. And then, in the distance, I saw it, a faint glow on the horizon. A building. Something man-made. Something that could save me. My pulse quickened, and I pushed myself harder, my legs trembling beneath me. I didn't know if I was imagining it, if my mind was playing tricks on me, but I didn't care. I just needed to get to that light, to find shelter before the figures caught up with me. As I ran, the glow grew brighter, more distinct. It was real. It had to be. But then, just as I thought I might reach it, the ground gave way beneath my feet. I fell hard, my body tumbling into the darkness as I plunged into what felt like a deep, narrow pit. The cold dirt scraped against my skin as I hit the bottom, the impact knocking the wind out of me. I lay there for a moment, dazed, my heart still pounding in my ears. My whole body ached, my head spinning from the fall. I tried to move, to push myself up, but the pain was too much. My chest heaved with exhaustion, and all I could do was lie there, staring up at the night sky. The glow in the distance seemed farther away now, unreachable. And as I lay there, gasping for breath, I realized with a sinking dread that I wasn't alone. The sound of footsteps echoed above me. They had found me. I lay at the bottom of the pit, my body trembling, the cold desert air biting at my skin. Every inch of me ached, and for a moment, all I could do was gasp for breath, my chest heaving from the fall. Above me, the dim glow from the distant building felt impossibly far away, unreachable. My heart pounded in my ears, and the weight of everything that had happened pressed down on me like a heavy blanket. But it wasn't just the fall that had me frozen in place. It was the sound of the footsteps. They had found me. I could hear them moving above, the faint crunch of gravel and dirt as the figures circled the edge of the pit. I couldn't see them, but I could feel their presence, oppressive and heavy, like the air itself was thickening around me. My breath came in short, panic bursts, and I struggled to push myself up, to move, but my body refused to cooperate. For a second, everything was silent. The only sound my own shallow breathing and the distant whistle of the desert wind. And then, I heard it, a voice, low and cold, coming from the edge of the pit. "You thought you could run?" A chill shot down my spine. It was the driver's voice. But there was something different about it now, something darker. There was no urgency in it, no hint of the panic he'd shown earlier. Instead, it was calm, almost taunting. I forced myself to sit up, my muscles screaming in protest, and looked up. The figures were standing at the edge of the pit, their faces still obscured by the shadows. But I could see the driver now, standing among them, his silhouette outlined by the faint glow of the distant building. "You shouldn't have come this way," he said, his voice steady. "But now that you have, you'll see. This is where you belong." My heart raced, my mind spinning with fear and confusion. I didn't understand. Hadn't he told me to run? Hadn't he warned me to get away? Why had he suddenly changed? And why did it feel like everything, every decision I'd made, had led me exactly to this moment? I struggled to stand, my legs shaking beneath me, but I refused to give up. "What do you want from me?" I shouted, my voice cracking with desperation. "Why are you doing this?" The driver didn't answer right away. He just stared down at me, the flicker of a twisted smile crossing his face. "You were always meant to end up here," he said finally. "We've been waiting for you for a long time." My blood turned to ice. The words echoed in my head, sending a wave of nausea through me. There it was again, the same phrase I'd heard over and over since this nightmare began. "We've been waiting." But why? I demanded, my voice trembling. "I don't understand. I didn't do anything. I'm just trying to get home." The driver took a step closer to the edge of the pit, his eyes locking onto mine. "That's where you're wrong. You didn't just stumble onto this road. You didn't just end up here by chance. You were drawn to it." I shook my head, confusion and fear mixing into a terrible knot in my chest. "No, that's not possible. I was just hitchhiking." His smile widened, dark and unsettling. "People don't come here by accident. They come because they're meant to." I opened my mouth to protest, but before I could say anything, I heard another sound, a soft rustling behind me. I froze, my skin prickling with fear, and slowly turned around. At first, I thought I was seeing things. There was another figure, crouched in the shadows at the bottom of the pit. But as I looked closer, my stomach lurched with horror. It wasn't just a figure. It was me. I stared, disbelief flooding my mind as I took in the sight. The person crouched in the shadows, covered in dirt, bruised and bleeding. It was an exact replica of me, down to the torn jacket and the look of fear in their eyes. My heart thundered in my chest, and for a moment, I thought I was losing my mind. But the figure didn't move. It just stared back at me, mirroring my expression of shock and terror. "What is this?" I whispered, my voice trembling. What's happening?" The driver's voice came from above, calm and steady. "It's what you came here to find." I looked up at him, confusion and terror battling for control of my mind. "Find? What are you talking about?" "You came to this road because you were searching for something," the driver said, his eyes dark and unreadable. "Something you've been running from your entire life. And now, it's caught up to you." I shook my head, trying to make sense of his words. No, I didn't." But before I could finish, the figure at the bottom of the pit stood up. It was me, my reflection, my twin, whatever it was. But as it rose to its full height, I saw the truth. The bruises on its face, the dirt smeared across its skin, the haunted look in its eyes. It wasn't just a reflection of me as I was now. It was a reflection of everything I had been avoiding, everything I had refused to face. And then it spoke. You can't run from yourself forever. My blood ran cold. The voice was mine, but it was filled with a darkness, a weight that I had never heard before. It was like all of my fears, my doubts, my guilt had taken on a life of their own and come to confront me here, at the end of the road. I staggered back, my mind reeling. No, this isn't real. This can't be real. But the figure, my other self, stepped closer, its eyes locked on mine. You've been running for so long. You thought you could escape, but no one ever escapes. Behind me, I heard the driver chuckle softly. Now you understand. And in that moment I did. The road, the figures, the strange warnings, they weren't random. They weren't part of some supernatural conspiracy. They were my own creation, my own doing. I had been running from myself for so long, avoiding the things I didn't want to face, that I had finally created a world where my fears could catch up to me. This road, this desert, it wasn't a place. It was me. It was everything I had refused to deal with, everything I had buried deep down, all coming to life in the most terrifying way possible. My chest tightened, and I turned to face the driver one last time. This is all in my head, isn't it? He nodded slowly. We're all part of you. The road ends here. My pulse raced, and I looked back at the figure, my other self, as it closed in on me, its eyes filled with the weight of all my regrets, all my mistakes. I had nowhere left to run, and as the darkness closed in, I finally understood. I wasn't escaping this road. I've been on it my whole life,